And there are photographs in this reportage that show these people, Cuban exiles, in combat gear, combat uniforms, carrying assault weapons, and training for commando raids against Cuba. This is the situation that Cuba is faced with in Miami. So naturally, if they send their own people to Miami to report back here as early as possible on the planning of terrorist activities, such as the bombing of tourist hotels here, a whole campaign was carried out in the late 1990s against hotels in order to try to scare tourists away from Cuba. The Cubans eventually caught these people, and they were Central American mercenaries hired by one of the most notorious of the Cuban terrorists, a man trained by the CIA, a man who worked for years for the CIA, and who continued through the years to carry out terrorist attacks against Cuban targets. This man's name is Luis Posada Cariles. One of the most notorious terrorist acts of this man, Luis Posada Cariles, was his help in the planning of the bombing of the Cuban commercial airliner in early October 1976, in which all 73 people on board were killed. He has a litany that stretches through the years. He was eventually arrested by Venezuelan authorities and charged with that crime.
Usted fue el que las pensó, el que las organizó y el que mandó a la gente para que las hiciera.
Yo de cualquier hecho dentro del territorio cubano en contra del régimen de La Habana me responsabilizo totalmente.
But he escaped from prison, and in the early 1980s he showed up in El Salvador, where he began work at the El Pongo Air Base outside San Salvador in the CIA's resupply operations to the Contras operating in Nicaragua. Another of the most famous of the CIA-trained Cuban terrorists is a pediatrician named Orlando Bosch. Orlando Bosch has a record going back to the 1960s of dozens of terrorist activities. He too was working with Posada Cariles in the bombing of the Cuban airliner in 1976. He was arrested by the Venezuelans. He was tried 3 times, and 3 times on technicalities he was acquitted. Of course, all the money for the support for Bosch and for the, let's say, the springing from prison of Posada Cariles came from these extremist Cuban Americans in Miami around the Cuban American National Foundation. In 1987, the Venezuelans released Bosch, and he left the country. He turns up in the United States, I believe it's in February of 1988. He's immediately arrested on charges stemming from a parole violation of a conviction or on a conviction from a previous terrorist act in the United States. The next year, 1989, or from that time on, the Department of Justice creates a report showing that he is a known terrorist. They list these terrorist acts. In this document, there were 30 terrorist acts, and it was a justification for his expulsion from the United States as an undesirable. He was on the verge of being expelled from the United States in early 1990 when another of the Cuban extremists in Miami, this time is a congresswoman, Ileana Ros-Martinez, begins to lobby on his behalf, that is on Bush's behalf, with then-President Bush the father, to quash the deportation order. The main support that she has is from her campaign manager, the man responsible for her election to the Congress in Washington, who is none other than Jeb Bush, the son of the then-president and future governor of Florida. So between two of them, they prevail on the father, George Bush Sr., to quash the deportation order in 1990 against Orlando Bosch. He is set free, and he's been walking the streets of Miami ever since, a free man. But he has never renounced terrorism.
Hay derecho a derribar aviones, a hundir barcos, un submarino, a hacer cualquier cosa.
Posada Cariles was arrested in Panama in the year 2000, along with 3 other very well-known CIA-trained terrorists, sabotage experts. They were captured, or they were arrested with a large amount of, I believe it was C4 explosive, enough to have killed hundreds, if not more than 1,000 people. Their plan was to exploded a bomb at the auditorium where Fidel Castro was to be speaking at the University of Panama during the Ibero-American Summit. In fact, he was arrested just at the time the conference was beginning. One of the most interesting aspects of the arrest of Posada Carriles and the other three in Panama in 2000 was the role that the Cuban intelligence service played in these arrests. It happens that they were on the trail of these guys from somewhere in Central America. It's never been revealed. But all through their stay in Panama, they knew the remote farm where these guys were holed up with their explosives. And they knew the hotels where they were staying. So that when Fidel Castro went to this summit meeting, where the King of Spain was present, when the president of the Spanish government was there, and the chiefs of state of all the Latin American countries, or the Spanish-speaking countries, were also present. When Fidel arrived for this conference, he immediately gave a press conference. And in this press conference, he gave out all this information about these terrorists.
Posada Carriles arribó a Panamá el 5 de noviembre con documentación falsa y sin ningún disfraz. Tiene en Panamá cómplices de su entera confianza, en los cuales se apoya. Una copia del caballero. Estamos pidiendo la cooperación del pueblo.
They were then immediately arrested by the Panamanian police. And they were then held under arrest for years until they were finally brought to trial. But it was a tremendous coup for the Cuban intelligence service, and simply reminded me of when I was in the CIA. The Cuban intelligence service was a very important target for us to penetrate. As far as I know, the Cuban service was never penetrated by an agent of the CIA who was on the inside of that service.
And they have tried, I tried myself, in many different ways to penetrate this service, by recruiting their people, by trying to break their codes, to get their code pads from embassies and so forth. And I have no doubt at all that in the